Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins had another debate moderated by Alex O'Connor. So Jordan Peterson is a famous psychologist, well known for his public lectures on the story of Genesis.
In the story of the Tower of Babel, human beings make this massive building that's supposed to reach up to the heavens so that it'll take the place of God.
And very recently, he's released a new book called We Who Wrestle with God. And he's arguably the most influential evangelist of our time, even though some people argue if he's even a Christian.
So, Jordan Peterson seems, to me, to be an atheist. I mean, he thinks that God is a fictional character.
But he's recently been seen with his new suit that seems to suggest otherwise. On the other side, you have Richard Dawkins, who's a staunch critic of religion and well known for his book, The God Delusion. And while Dawkins respects Peterson, he thinks Peterson's discussions on the symbolism in religious texts such as the Bible is bullshit.
When he talks about religion, I think it's bullshit. I think that he doesn't make any sense at all. I think he's impressing people by using language they don't understand.
So people, including myself, have been wanting this discussion for years now. It's exciting that it's finally here. However, having watched it, I must say that I found the conversation mostly frustrating. And I think it's because Dawkins does not understand what Peterson means by symbolic truth. So Dawkins seems to kind of dismiss what Peterson says as bullshit because he's focused on historical truth. However, in the last 10 minutes, they do begin to find some mutual understanding. So maybe Dawkins will kind of reconsider his view on Jordan Peterson and his religious ideas, but that's still unclear at this point. My belief is that this disagreement between the two stems from two different notions of what they mean by true. So Dawkins is fixated on historical truth, whether the Bible is literally true, whether Jesus was actually resurrected and born of a virgin, whether characters like Cain and Abel are historical events. And Jordan Peterson's focusing on the symbolic truth that's contained within the biblical stories, essentially independent on whether or not the stories are literally true. So in a general sense, symbolic truth is about reoccurring patterns of human behavior that are contained within stories. And so this is what Jordan Peterson is focusing on, while Dawkins doesn't seem to grasp this idea and is primarily focused on kind of taking a literal understanding of religious text and then questioning the truthfulness in that sense. Some people might dismiss symbolic truth as simply bullshit, but in this video, I'm going to explain why that's not the case. And in fact, that there really are multiple kinds of truth, even in scientific fields such as physics and machine learning. So in a general sense, there's two kinds of truth. There's specific truths and general truths. And so the idea here is that kind of as you act in the world, you see specific events, and then you start to notice that there might be a pattern in these events. And from those events, then you can try to articulate what that pattern is and combine that into what I'm calling a model. Now, from this model, if it's a good model, it will generalize beyond just the events that went into the model. And so anything else that kind of comes out of the model, I'm calling that an instantiation. So in the case of kind of scientific theories, right, you have maybe the events would be actual experiments and experimental data. Then from that, you build a model or a theory to try to understand what that data is. And then a good model generalizes, and now you can make predictions about new experiments that could be done. But also, your model should contain the original experiments that went into the model. Be more concrete, in the case of symbolic truths, you can imagine this example. I'm showing the same pattern with event model and instantiation in this diagram. But an example of this, you can imagine you're talking about the event, the actual historical person of Hitler. But then there's a pattern in the kind of behavior that Hitler exhibited, right? And you can say that there's something shared between Hitler and other leaders such as Stalin or Mao or Kim Jong-un, right? And you could say that this pattern that they share is something like the pattern of the tyrant, right? And this is what an archetype is. So an archetype is the abstraction of the pattern of behavior. Once you have a model, you can talk about instances of that model. So instances of the archetype, an example of this could be King Joffrey from Game of Thrones, right? So King Joffrey, as a fictional character, is embodying the archetype of the tyrant. And so if you're trying to talk about the properties of the tyrant, whether or not the actual instance you're looking at is fictional or historically accurate is irrelevant. And so this is what Jordan Peterson's trying to get at when he's talking about these symbolic truths that are contained within these stories. He's getting at what's the underlying structure behind the characters in the story. To say that these symbolic truths is bullshit is to say that there really is no thing like the archetype of the tyrant, right? But that we know that's not true. We know that there's some shared property of Hitler that is seen among other characters, both historical figures as well as fictional characters. Now, if I tried to talk about what is that property and I said something like a loving, compassionate leader, right, there's something in you that says that's not true. But for you to even have that feeling means that you believe in the fact that there is a general pattern. You know, whether you're familiar with it, you know how to articulate it or not, the fact that you have a sense of that's not true implies that you believe in a pattern of behavior that characterizes someone like Hitler. That concept that you must have is what an archetype is. And so hopefully this kind of, articulates in this metaphorical sense, in this sense of narratives, kind of the difference between specific and general truths. Now, I also want to demonstrate that this property of specific and general truths and kind of the idea between, actual characters versus archetypes, this structure is also present in technical fields. So this example, this diagram I show here is from machine learning. You can imagine you're trying to build a model that can generate images of cats. And so the event in this case would be images of cats. And then from that, there's some property that all these images of cats share, and you try to articulate that into a model. In this case, some kind of neural network. And then an instantiation would be generating new cat photos. And so in this case, the model is kind of somehow learning what is the general property of what it means to be an image of a cat. So in the conversation between Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins is clearly very fixated on whether or not the story of Cain and Abel is literally true. And so here's a clip of him talking about this.
Do you believe Cain existed?
I think the pattern that Cain represents is an eternal pattern. And so
yes,
it's a higher
different.
level of existence.
That's different. I realize
well, there
that.
are Cain types who exist, and they're
There are Cain types. But Cain himself.
So in this analogy of machine learning, essentially the question that Richard Dawkins keeps fixating on is the question of asking, is this image of the cat in the bottom right corner real or is it fake? So this back and forth happens multiple times, and Richard Dawkins keeps harping back to, well, is it real or is it fake? And Jordan Peterson's trying to articulate that it doesn't matter to him. It's kind of irrelevant to the point that he's trying to make. He's trying to talk about the general structure.
There are Cain types. But Cain himself, I mean, you give the game away where you say in your book, Cain and Abel were the first humans to be born in the natural way. Now that betrays you as it were pretending you think they really existed, because you wouldn't have said they were born in a natural way unless you were muddling up facts with symbols there, because you don't think that Cain and Abel existed.
Well, I don't. What do I think about Cain and Abel? I said, I think the pattern that they represent always exists. Always exists.
You understand that that's a different thing.
Quite a different matter. A pattern that they represent, the conflict between brothers, the rivalry between brothers. This is a fundamental pattern, which yes, it's something that's there. But I care about facts. I mean, did they exist or did they not exist?
And again here, what we see is Richard Dawkins is still hung up on the question of whether or not the story of Cain and Abel is true, which in this kind of analogy would be whether or not this is a real image of a cat. And so the discussion that they're having is essentially as if Jordan Peterson's trying to talk about the structure of this neural network and how it's learning these, complex properties of what it means to be a cat versus something else. And then, someone asking, I hear you, neural networks, whatever, but is that a real cat or not? I mean, it's a valid question. It is a question you can ask, and, depending on what you're interested in, maybe it even matters. But I guess my main point is it's completely missing the point that Jordan Peterson's trying to make. So Jordan Peterson is talking about and trying to, bring the conversation towards the symbolic patterns that are contained within a story like Cain and Abel that are true independent of whether or not Cain and Abel is historically accurate or a fictional story. And kind of based on this conversation, it seems like Richard Dawkins is just essentially completely missing the point. So I want to talk about one more example of this specific and general truth concept that I'm trying to lay out here. In the case of quantum mechanics, And then also I want to talk about a frustration that I experienced in another part of the conversation using this example of quantum mechanics. Here's a diagram I have kind of laying out the same structure that we talked about for the previous examples. In this case, kind of prior to the existence of quantum mechanics and its development, there was several experiments that were essentially misunderstood, or from a classical perspective alone, we couldn't understand the experimental data. And two of these examples are what are called black body radiation, and then also spectral lines that come, spectral lines for atoms such as hydrogen. Now, from this theory, there's a prediction for what's called the double slit experiment. This is, a very famous experiment. There's a lot of videos on YouTube. It's a very kind of talked about experiment. It kind of encapsulates kind of the bizarre aspects of quantum mechanics quite well. And so a brief discussion on what's going on in this experiment, in case you haven't heard about it. The idea is that you're shooting electrons at this wall with two slits in it, and then there's a screen on the back that detects where the electron hits that screen. And so kind of the idea, you would imagine that as the electrons are shot at this wall with the two slits, the pattern on the far screen is going to match that of the two slits in the wall if you shoot enough electrons at this. However, this isn't what is found. You actually get this interference pattern, and you get these many stripes over the entire size of the screen. And what this experiment is really elucidating is that it's inappropriate to think about the electron as a point-like particle, as was previously thought in a classical mechanical setting. With this example in mind, here's another clip from the conversation.
But did Cain and Abel really exist? And I know that you want to say that the story which
I think it's a silly question. I think it's like asking whether Raskolnikov existed in Crime and Punishment. Like, it's not a trivial question, because you can answer yes and you can answer no. You can say, well, there was no such specific person as Raskolnikov. But it's not a helpful question, because the reason that Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is a masterpiece is because Raskolnikov was everywhere in Russia when Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment. And so Raskolnikov is hyper real, not real.
This question that Jordan Peterson is saying is kind of a silly question. To me, it's indicative of a lack of understanding of the symbolism that Jordan Peterson is trying to talk about. It's a kind of analogy in the case of quantum mechanics. It would be like asking a question such as, well, does the electron go through both slits at the same time? And what this question would illuminate is that, you're kind of missing the entire point of quantum mechanics and what the lesson is to be learned from looking at this particular experiment. Now, it's a reasonable question. When I first started studying quantum mechanics, I asked the same question. I mean, this is a very counterintuitive experiment, but the point I guess I'm trying to make is that the asking of the question, it indicates a lack of understanding, right? And so you could imagine someone saying, it seems like you're suggesting that the electron goes through both slits at the same time. Like, quantum mechanics must be bullshit, right? Like, that's what someone might, you could imagine somebody actually saying that in the case of quantum mechanics. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that the kind of question that Dawkins is asking Jordan Peterson is exactly analogous. And what it indicates is that Richard Dawkins does not understand kind of these symbolic truths. This isn't an insult to Dawkins, right? Jordan Peterson's been thinking about these things for decades, and Richard Dawkins hasn't. So it's not an insult on Richard Dawkins, but to me, it's kind of clearly demonstrating that Richard Dawkins is very unfamiliar with this way of thinking, and so I don't feel like he's in a position to be able to say whether or not he thinks what Jordan Peterson is saying is bullshit. So this disagreement between Dawkins and Peterson essentially went on for 80 minutes of a 90-minute podcast. And so that's largely why I found the podcast frustrating. But one of the exciting parts is towards the end of the podcast, there was actually some agreement between them, and it seemed like they were starting to understand each other's languages. And so this had to do with what's called the Baldwin effect. And so here's a clip of them talking about this idea.
Perhaps we need to explain what the Baldwin
I was
effect
going to say that's probably helpful.
Yes, that would be useful.
Okay. It was suggested by Baldwin, I think in the late 19th century. It's a kind of genetic assimilation of a cultural or a learned idea. So The idea is that certain animals learn things, learn a clever trick. It might be nut cracking by chimpanzees, for example, or potato washing by Japanese macaques, or opening milk bottles by English tits. And it perhaps spread as mimetically as an epidemic of copying, and that's known to have happened with the blue tits and great tits in Britain. Now, certain individuals are likely to learn it faster than others, and there may be genetic variation in the speed with which they learn it. And as the generations go by, natural selection would have favored speed of learning the new trick. And eventually they would have learned the new trick so fast they didn't need to learn it at all.
Right.
It becomes genetically assimilated into the genome. That's the Baldwin effect.
Okay, that I would say that's essentially the same pattern of archetype evolution that's implicit in the Jungian theoretical
Well, that's
model.
very interesting, because that suggests that Jungian archetypes might be genetically assimilated via the Baldwin effect.
Yes,
Now, that's
yes.
a fascinating idea.
Yes.
You know, unfortunately, this happened essentially in the last 10 minutes of the conversation. And so, you know, right when it started to get good, the conversation essentially ended. And so I hope they have further discussions in the future to kind of flesh out these ideas, because it seems like they're finally starting to, you know, at least Richard Dawkins is finally starting to understand what Jordan Peterson is even saying. And so to me, that's exciting. Lastly, I just want to commend Richard Dawkins for actually having this conversation. You know, this is definitely outside of his zone of comfort, but he was willing to engage with it. And at the very end, it seemed like they were actually starting to find common ground. And so, you know, kudos to Richard Dawkins for actually having this conversation. That's essentially it for my video. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. You know, if you found this helpful and you thought kind of my analogies with machine learning and quantum mechanics were insightful, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, give it a thumbs down. If you're still kind of, you know, think what Jordan Peterson is saying is bullshit, let me know in the comments down below. Make sure to subscribe for more videos like this. And until next time.